Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing. Thank our witnesses for being here. I'd first like to start, Mr. Chairman, by sending my prayers and support to the people of Southwest Louisiana, including Lake Charles, who are still recovering from the devastation of Hurricane Laura. I personally went and witnessed this, met with local officials along with President Trump 2 weeks ago. They have a long way to go, a lot of devastation. Everybody is standing with them, and we will continue to stand with those strong, resilient people in Southwest Louisiana to help them as they rebuild their homes and their communities. So thank you. And with that, now let's talk about today's hearing. Let me first be clear. Every American who is legally eligible to vote will have that opportunity on November 3rd and is strongly encouraged to exercise their right to vote as well. Each state runs their elections, as we know, and it is our duty to ensure that our elections are run fairly, freely, and safely. One of the ways we must protect every American's right to vote is to ensure the integrity of their vote, to make sure that that integrity is preserved by rooting out voter fraud, which is well documented. We must also make sure that every American who wants to safely vote in person will have that right. I urge all members on a bipartisan basis to convey that message to the American people. The 2020 elections will be conducted safely, freely, and fairly, and we urge all those who are eligible to participate. 7 months into this COVID-19 pandemic, the American people have reminded the world about what it means to be an American. We hold our constitutional rights sacred. A pandemic will not stand in the way of Americans exercising our First Amendment rights. Americans still have the right to peacefully assemble and peacefully protest. Americans must also have the ability to exercise our religious freedom and the right to worship as we believe. As with previous pandemics, like the Spanish flu of 1918, or military wars, or periods of unrest, America will confidently go to the polls in November. I've spent a good part of August traveling the country and talking with voters, Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarians. Americans are ready and they are motivated to vote. They deserve to hear from leaders in both parties that the elections will be held safely and fairly. Instead of urging losing candidates to refuse to concede, which unfortunately we've heard recently, as some are suggesting, or trying to change laws in ways that would drag out the result for weeks and weeks after election night. We need to ensure that state laws, which have been debated and honed over years, are respected and allowed to be implemented fairly and efficiently. What people do not want to hear is one political party attempting to take advantage of a pandemic to try to ram through their partisan election scheme that has nothing at all to do with this coronavirus. Let's listen to the experts and let's follow the science. The unanimous opinion of our top public health experts is that in-person voting can be done safely. On August 13th, when asked if people could go safely to vote in person during this pandemic, Dr. Fauci said, and I quote, "I think if carefully done according to the guidelines, there's no reason that I can see why that would not be the case. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to vote in person or otherwise." On August 20th, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Dr. Robert Redfield, announced that the CDC put out guidance on how to safely vote in person. Dr. Redfield stated, and I quote, "I think people can be able to social distance and wear masks, and with the recommendations we have for hygiene, we don't see that there is going to be a negative impact on your ability to vote from a public health perspective. I know I am going to vote face to face," close quote. In an interview on August 22nd, Dr. Deborah Birx said, quote, "I can tell you it has been safe for me to go to Starbucks and pick up my order. So if you can go into Starbucks in the middle of Texas and Alabama and Mississippi that have very high case rates, then I can't say that it would be different waiting in line in the polls," close quote. A recent report from the Brennan Center for Justice advises, quote, In-person voting can be conducted safely if jurisdictions take the necessary steps to minimize the risk of transmission of COVID-19 to voters and election workers, close quote. I hope all of my colleagues will take the opportunity to highlight CDC's guidance for safe in-person voting. CDC put out these really good guidelines showing you how to safely do this, just like with safely going to school. You can educate people in person. Some are choosing to do it, some are choosing to deny those kids that opportunity. And we've talked about that here in this committee, Mr. Chairman. Just on that same level, I would urge that we follow the guidelines for safely voting in person. There are a lot of options for people to vote. You can request a mail-in ballot. You can vote early in many states. They have those opportunities. Or you can go vote in person, as many want to do. We ought to be promoting those guidelines. Look at some of the examples CDC put out in these guidelines right here. Ensure that poll locations are adequately staffed to cover any sick workers. Provide hand sanitizer for use at each step in the voting process. Encourage voters to use masks while in the polling location. Here's mine. You'll appreciate the colors, Mr. Chairman. I'll send you one extra if you want. I know you've got one of your own. Post signs in highly visible locations that promote everyday protective measures. Remind voters upon arrival to leave space between themselves and others. Have plans to manage lines to ensure social distancing. These are all things that are in those guidelines and more. If we follow those, you can safely vote in person. I hope all my colleagues remind voters that since the beginning of March, when President Trump declared a national emergency due to the pandemic, 37 different states, plus the District of Columbia, have successfully held statewide primaries for president or their own state offices. I've personally voted in 2 different elections that we've had in the last few months in the state of Louisiana. I did it in person. It was a safe experience. I brought my son with me, as I normally do. We bring our children to vote with us so they can see this great democratic process that so many generations have passed on. And there was never a worry. I wore my mask. So did the poll workers. It was a very smooth process. I would encourage people to do that as well. Wisconsin held a very successful election near the height of the pandemic on April 7th. A peer-reviewed study published in the August issue of the American Journal of Public Health concluded that in-person voting in Wisconsin's election by more than 400,000 electors did not produce a detectable surge in coronavirus cases. We should all be following that science. We've established procedures for absentee voting, early voting, and in some states, voting by mail. America is ready to go vote. Many states vote by absentee ballot, or they request mail ballots. These procedures have been in place for each state that does it. They all handle it a little bit differently, but those systems have been worked through years so that they know how to do it properly, how to do it safely, how to do it efficiently. We should inspire confidence in those procedures. There's simply no pandemic-related reason to change the way we vote in 2020. Given the topic of today's hearing, ensuring a free, fair, and safe election during the corona pandemic, we could just stop right there. We know how to do it. States are doing it. We should help them do it. But our Democrat colleagues do not want to join with us today and send that bipartisan message. They want to go back to advancing a bill, H.R. 1. This is something that Democrats have been promoting since last year, long before this pandemic, that does all kinds of things to mandate that states change the way that most of them do business, requiring things that most states don't want to do, haven't done because they actually make elections less safe. They reduce the integrity of elections. Let's talk about it. They want to mandate ballots be mailed to all registered voters during this emergency. That, as I outlined, is dangerous. A review by Judicial Watch in early 2020 found that 378 different counties nationwide have more registered voters than voting age citizens. 378 counties. That's millions of ballots that would be out there illegally. Who knows what would happen with them, but that's a staggering number. 378 counties nationwide have more registered voters on their roll than voting age citizens. And people say there's no opportunity for voter fraud. More than 28 million mail-in ballots went missing in the last 4 elections, according to data collected from the Election Assistance Commission. It's a federal commission that identified more than 28 million ballots that have just gone missing. Who knows where they end up, if they end up in a ballot box, as we saw in other states where weeks and weeks after the election, they were still counting votes. Somehow they just kept mysteriously showing up until it changed the outcome of an election. Do we really want to go to that level where there are millions of ballots, in this case, 28 million mail-in ballots that literally went missing? Those are staggering numbers that we should all be concerned about as we want to promote fair, free, and safe elections. That's what we should be focused on. We don't want a recipe for disaster where we literally would be counting ballots. Weeks and weeks later, they would be showing up from who knows where, as we saw in states. We saw it in Florida. We saw it in California. In New Jersey, people are going to go to jail for voter fraud. There's all kinds of cases that are cited. In the end, why don't we put our focus on helping those states conduct fair, efficient, free, and safe elections for all Americans who are legally eligible to vote? Look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.